Should we start?
Yeah, we should start. I don't have.
I think we should start with follow up. We've never done follow up before, but boy, have we got follow up.
Yeah, so it turns out that I'm a bit of an arsehole.
Yep.
The internet erupted with one person saying that wasn't very nice what you did there. So, for context, in the last episode, we discussed...
Should we have a dream sequence and then play a clip? No, carry on. You describe it.
Yeah, okay.
As it happened.
So, in context, in the last episode, we discussed private accounts on Twitter and the impact of having friends request it and you rejecting them. So, to figure out how that worked, I did it to you. And some people got very upset with me for doing that. So if you want to listen to it, there's a clip on YouTube that'll be in the show notes. And the show notes can be found at listen.co/podcast/6. And there's a link to it there. But it's only like 5 minutes long. And people got quite upset about it.
In hindsight, it was a social experiment with me as the victim.
So what are your feelings on it now? Have you struck me from your Christmas card list?
Well, I mean, I didn't need to. It was already a done deal. But having listened, right. So what happened at the time was that we have this note. We have these notes, and all the notes said right then was private accounts. And I knew that you were going to get to it, and you'd only showed me these notes on the day. And you'd done that purposefully so I wouldn't suspect. But I saw that on the notes. I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, we're going to get to that. And then he's going to want to talk about the stupid private account that he doesn't let me have access to. And then, and so as we got to it, and it was clearly about to come up, I was like, you know what? I really hope that he starts this off by asking me, what do you think about private accounts? So then I can just tell him that I do not feel comfortable with this conversation. And then you did ask me, and the fact that you did ask me, really, I should have had my guard up. And in hindsight, it's really obvious that you were trying to get something out of me. Like you were expecting, you were poking me for, what do you think of that thing? Like it should have been obvious, but for some reason it wasn't.
It's obvious. The tone's obvious in on the YouTube video because I put the little emoji in, and I've got like the little smirky face on me going, "Hey, want to talk about this?" And then you going, "No."
Yeah, the videos on you did the videos on YouTube, and those are actually really good. If you want to check out the YouTube videos, like really do it, because the emoji thing we should keep on doing. Those were really funny. Like that was half of the entertainment. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and see the video. It's really good.
But yeah, so we got some feedback saying that I shouldn't have done it because other people... Actually, we got some feedback from people who had the same situation for friends had rejected them from their private accounts, and it said it just made them feel like shit. I think is a quote verbatim from somebody who got in touch with me. It was like, that happened to me, made me feel terrible. And some other people were saying that they sympathise with you because they had also tried to request my account and had been... like I'd said no. And they got upset.
But in my case, it was for an experiment. In their case, you genuinely rejected them.
Well, no, yeah.
One person said to me, do you suspect that he rejected you along with everyone else, and then he felt bad for it later on, so then he did a 180. He was like, oh, it was all a joke. It was a practical joke for the podcast. No is the answer. I don't think he did that at all.
No, but that is a valid question, because it could be just like that you wanted to follow it, and I said no, and I then had to go, oh, I needed an excuse to do this. But no, it wasn't like that at all, because my opinion was that I didn't really enjoy private accounts to start with, so I didn't make it for any valid reason. And if I had, then that'd be different. But because I didn't, then it wasn't the reason to do it. And I didn't create it just to annoy you, because whilst I'm not the nicest person in the world, I'm not that horrible either.
Of course you're not.
Not all the time, anyway.
As a result of our Twitter conversation last time, I ended up thinking through some of our thoughts on like how Twitter could be better, and I wrote this blog post
about the channels.
Yeah, it's a concept called Twitter channels, where basically everyone's feed is split up. You can have an all feed where everything goes into, that's the default, and then you can have one for gossip if you want, or you can have one for politics or one for gaming, and then people who follow you, they're automatically following all of them. But if they don't care about what you're saying about politics, they can just unfollow the politics channel, and all tweets that you post into your politics channel won't appear for them. And I think that solves a lot of the problems with people unfollowing other people because of one aspect of the account that they didn't like. And also solve the problem because you can have these channels be private. So you don't need to have a separate account just because you want a private account. You don't have to go and promote it and do all of the other things associated with it, like get people to follow it. So yeah, we'll put the blog post in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I've added it to my list. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. I love feedback. People should always give us feedback because I found that quite... It was good because it justified us doing that discussion, and it also validated our opinions as well because people had the same experience. Cool. So we have a bunch of stuff to talk about today, so it's not just going to be one topic. Normally we do one thing a week, but I want to talk about a couple of things. You want to talk about a couple of things. So
yeah, I like the idea that we're being experimental and trying these things out.
Basically, I want to talk about Deadpool, and I think this is the only way you would let me talk about a superhero movie on the show.
As if it only lasted for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go and let's talk about Deadpool.
So, do you know anything about Deadpool?
I saw the trailer for it. That's what I know of it.
Were you aware of the movie beforehand?
No.
It's a Marvel character who exists like inside the Marvel universe, and he's more associated with the X-Men than he's got like Wolverine. Do you know who Wolverine is?
Yep.
He's got Wolverine style healing powers, and he was a mercenary who had cancer and then got treatment on him and got experimented on by the Weapon X program, which is the same people who messed around with Wolverine and gave him his adamantium stuff. So it's that same kind of program, and then out of that he became a superhero. And he's very violent. He's very self-aware. He knows he's in a comic book, and he breaks the fourth wall, and that's just kind of who he is. So they've been trying to make this movie for ages, and they put him in X-Men Origins Wolverine, which came out in 2009, I think. Did you see that?
No. Was he played by the same actor in that movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it was a terrible film, and also they completely crapped on the character. Like he's known as the Merc with the mouth because he's really sarcastic, and they sewed his mouth shut in the X-Men Origins movie. They've been wanting to make a proper one since then. I saw it on Wednesday, and I absolutely loved it. It was everything that I wanted it to be. I wrote a review about it on my site. My review, for some reason, isn't on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't understand it, but probably.
So did they reinvent the character from X-Men Origins or whatever it's called?
Origins.
Or did...
Yeah, they made it more comic book accurate, so they thought they could start again, retcon what happened in X-Men Origins, and just start again as if he was a new character. And that's what they do. Although, because he's very meta and he knows that he's in a comic book movie, he also knows that film exists too. So they take the piss out of that film in the movie as well. Those kind of jokes are really good. And then he makes jokes about how the studio was really... how the budget was really small in this film, so he was like, it's really strange that I only keep running into you two X-Men in this massive house. It's almost like the studio didn't give us very much money. And that's the kind of humor in it. And it's really good.
What's the reason for them going with all those fourth wall jokes?
Because that's what the character's like in the comics.
Okay.
So he addresses the audience in the comics as well. Where the comic book movie thing is at the moment, where every other film that comes out is a superhero film, I think this is a really good breath of fresh air, and I think that it serves better now than if it had come out 5 years ago when they tried to make it, because it's almost like taking the piss out of the fact that all the movies now are superhero films, and I don't think that would have played as well before when there was only one or two a year, whereas this year I think there's 6 or 7. So I think it works well for being out now. But yeah, it's funny, it's witty. The humor is really like I was watching it and I was thinking you would hate this film.
So other than the superheroes, what about it would I hate?
The humor is very crass, like it's just dick joke a second,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that if you're not a fan of comic books, crass humor or superhero movies, then I don't think much of the humor would play off for you. So I don't think you would find the jokes funny because one, you wouldn't get a lot of the references. So if you haven't seen all the X-Men movies, oh no, you don't have to see all the. If you haven't seen some of the X-Men movies and you aren't aware of everything that's going on with the superhero genre, I don't think a lot of the jokes would work for you.
You wrote in your review that line you said just before about if you're not a fan of crass humor or comic books or superhero movies, this probably won't be for you. I feel like that line was aimed at me.
No, because you're not the only person who is like that. But I think that
you should introduce me to them. I think we'd get on like a house on fire.
We should put you in a house on fire.
Carry on.
So, yeah, no, so like I loved it. I thought it was great. They're going to make more of them. They greenlit the sequel. It's going to go in the same release spot as whatever it is, as Fantastic Four 2 was meant to be in, because that film was dreadful. Because it was a film that took itself super seriously, and it was really dark, and it just didn't work. It was dull and boring, and it was all build up, and then there was like a 5-minute fight at the end, and then that was it, finished. And then they were like, hey, we should have a name for ourselves. This whole experience has been fantastic. Hey, and it's just, I hated that movie. It was.
So if you were going to put Deadpool on a scale of superhero movies, where would you put it?
I would put it probably in my top 10. So in my
how many have you seen? Like I would put it in my top 10 because I haven't seen 10.
So in my top 10 would or maybe in my top 5 would be The Dark Knight, Batman Begins, Spider-Man 2. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be up there though.
Anything else you want to say about Deadpool?
Go and see it. Everyone should go and see it. You should go and see it, and then.
You think I should go and see it?
And then complain to me about why it's bad. But
you know what? That might not be the case. I might go and see it and go, yeah, this had some really good bits, and I thought it was really good.
I think there's something to enjoy for everybody. I think that you might get tired of it after the first half hour because it's a bit much. Because the humor is relentless and it doesn't change, so it's always sort of crass humor. And if you have a limit to how much you could,
if you have a tolerance to it,
then I think that would wear thin pretty quickly. But that doesn't mean you wouldn't like it. It just means that you might only be able to put up with the first half hour, then you'd go, I've had enough of this, and turn it off.
What's that movie called? Scott something versus the universe or something like that?
Scott Pilgrim.
Yeah. It kind of, the way you're describing it kind of reminds me of that film.
Okay.
In a film that doesn't take itself too seriously and has a lot of that sort of humor in.
Yeah, and like in a situation where all the other comic book movies are the world is coming to an end, or there's 2 Versus movies coming out, so there's Batman v Superman comes out in a month, and Captain America Civil War, where all the Marvel heroes are fighting each other. This is just one where it's just a lot lighter. It doesn't take itself super seriously, but it still sticks to its guns to being what it is, and it knows what it's trying to be. And it's unapologetic about that, and I think that's really good. But you should go read my review, then you should go and see the film. Public service announcement. We're going to be discussing the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. So if you've not seen that or are partially through that and haven't got to the end, I would suggest skipping forward to one, or you can just pause this and come back once you've finished watching it. But consider yourself warned. We will be discussing Making a Murderer in full depth. Thank you. So, Making a Murderer is a Netflix documentary series about the murder case of Stephen Avery and the woman's name, who I can't remember. I can only remember it in that Ken Kratz accent where he says our name super softly, and it makes my spine chill. It is, I can't. But so you watched this way before I did, and then I was like, I'll get to it, like all things on Netflix. I'll get to it eventually, and then my podcast queue started filling with people talking about this. So I was like, right, fine, you win. I will watch this. And then for the preceding week and a half or however long it took me to watch it, I was just angry the entire time. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that I think Stephen Avery is innocent because a lot of the things don't add up. They just don't add up. But more than that, like I think there's a chance he could be guilty. I'm not totally convinced that he's innocent, but I think he probably is. I think that what I feel more strongly about is Brendan and the Brendan episodes, and especially I think it was episode 8. I feel more strongly about the Brendan issue because Brendan is this kid who is really not intelligent at all. He is an IQ of somewhere in the low 60s. He's just not an intelligent kid, and he had everything against him. So if you start, you had his lawyer who turned against him for his own benefit because he wanted to get elected to office. Being involved with this case would get him some public visibility, and it was all to do with his personal image. And then poor Brendan tried to get that guy taken off the case, and the judge is like, "Why do you want him taken off the case?" He's like, I think he thinks I'm guilty. He couldn't express it. The thing is that this lawyer sitting next to him is meant to be the guy who has his back out of everyone in all of this. And the guy didn't have his back, and the guy had Brendan go in and give a false confession to these guys, and they put pressure on him. So he went into these confessions, and it just made my blood boil watching this video, because it's like, the police know that they have to get Brendan to say, "We cut her hair." So they go, "All right, Brendan, so what did you see in the fire?" There was plastic and there was wood. So what else, Brendan? And of course there's been a thing on the news saying that he burnt her in the fire. So eventually he goes, "And body parts?" "Okay, good, Brendan. Which body parts do you see?" "Fingers?" "No, they didn't find any fingers." "What else, Brendan?" "And toes." "Okay, and what else, Brendan?" "And bit of leg." "And what else, Brendan?" And eventually gets to part of the head of something, and or maybe an ear or something, and they're like, "Oh, okay, Brendan, great, so you saw an ear." "Yes." And that's the one thing they take from it, and they just ignore everything else. And so they were talking about this on Hello Internet, and one of the really great analogies is that one of the guys on there used to be a teacher, and he said it reminded him of educating a kid in school. You know, one of the kids who just doesn't get it, and you're just like hurrying things along, and you're like, "No, that's not the quiet answer. Do you think it's this thing, or do you think it's this thing?" And you just guide them towards the answer. And that was totally shown in the fact that they said to him, he was talking to his mum on the phone. They advised that he call his mum to tell her what had happened before they talk to her, like, "Oh, you'll be in trouble if we talk to her. You better talk to her first." And the only reason that they're saying that is because they know that they have the recording, and that it'll just be another thing for their evidence pile. So, but he went on the phone with his mum, and he told his mum that he'd confessed to them, and then later he phones her in another recorded call and says, "No, I made it all up." And she was like, "How did you make it all up? How could you have known all those things?" And he was like, I guessed on my homework." And it's just like, oh, you know exactly what that kid's saying. Like, he is saying he is just guided into answers.
Yeah, he just wanted to say, he wanted to give them what they wanted to hear.
He did. And it's really captured in the fact that this interview ends with him basically confessing to murder, and then the police leaving the room, and him stopping them on the way out and saying, "Oh, will we be done by 3:29 or probably 2:29?" And they're like, "Why? What's a 2:29?" So, "Oh, well, I've got a hand in this assignment for this class."
And then they come back and like, "Sorry, we have to arrest you for murder."
Yeah, and they're like, "Oh, no, Brendan, look, we have your back. I know this is hard. Unfortunately, because of what you said." Yeah, they are totally you know what, the fact that he was in there without his parent, without his lawyer, he clearly wasn't capable of making that decision of not talking to them without a lawyer present, because he is so unintelligent. But the most heartbreaking thing to me was that he knows this. He knows like how unintelligent he is, and it takes him a bit of time afterwards for him to kind of come to the realization that he's in prison, obviously, or he's in jail, and for him to realize what's happened. And then he gets on the phone with his mum, and she goes, "Why did you do that?" And he goes, "It's because I'm stupid, Mom." And she's like, "Oh, you're not stupid to me." He's like, "I am, though." And that was just like really heartbreaking. I feel like I'm tearing up right now. That was really heartbreaking. And I think the fact that he's in prison right now for that crime is totally unjust. And also the fact that Ken Kratz is an absolute dickhead, and he was the special prosecutor on both of the trials, again, the one against Stephen Avery, and then the next week they started up again with the trial against Brendan. And so he goes into the trial with Stephen Avery, he's like, "Remember, so he killed her in the garage." And then they go into the trial with Brendan, and he goes, "Now remember, they killed her in the bedroom." And he sells a totally different set of events, and he gets both of these guys thrown in prison, accused of murder in totally different ways. Accused of the same murder in totally different ways. How can both of those stories be true?
I also think that he pulled a really horrible move in the beginning, because the way it's meant to work is you allocate a jury of people who are unbiased and are there to be convinced. And what they did when they arrested Stephen Avery was that Ken Kratz called a press event and walked through in horrific detail everything that they, as stated as fact, everything that they assumed went on. So to the point where it was like, he then tied her to the bed, he then raped her, he then did X and Y to her body, and then he killed her, and then and it was horrible, like to the point where nobody in the country who knew of that story would think anything than he's guilty. So regardless of who the jury are, they're going to walk in and say, right, he's guilty, and you're going to be starting on the defense because you already know in your head this graphic story you've been told, and it was a complete manipulation of these people, and I thought that was ridiculous.
One of the infuriating parts about that is that Stephen's lawyers, who by the way are the best people in the show, Dean Strang and Jerome Buting, were stand-up guys. They are just like heroes in this.
If you want to talk about contradiction between lawyers, you just look at Stephen Avery's defense against Brendan's defense, because they were behind him 100%, and they did they got emotional at points as well. Like one of them got quite upset and gets like visually angry at certain points because he feels that it's so unjust what's happening, and it's so slimy the techniques that the prosecution are taking, and like they are emotionally attached to the case, and they just feel for the family at every point.
One of the most infuriating parts of it was that after Ken Kratz had went out and done this big press release, and in detail, in horrific detail, they then went into the court case, and Stephen Avery's lawyers were not allowed to even mention any of that stuff. They weren't allowed to discard that evidence because it wasn't being entered as evidence in the trial. They then weren't allowed to bring it up or make efforts to discredit it because it wasn't being entered as evidence. But even though it wasn't entered as evidence, they'd all heard it already. The jury had heard all of it. And so the best that he could do was, like, for example, if he had the witness on the stand about, just to be about something like else. Like, so if you had the guy on the stand to say, do you think the person could have been killed there? And the person says no, and then he would add an additional question like, "Oh, but to be clear, you don't think the person could have been killed in the bedroom, do you?" And that was the only thing he could do to hint at this bedroom thing that they told you about in the press is incorrect. And when you're starting, like, the whole idea is innocent until proven guilty. When you start with this massive build-up of evidence against it, which is all in the press and not a part of the trial, how can it be called a fair trial anymore?
Yeah, it was not innocent until proven guilty. It was guilty or can't be proven guilty. And I'm not. So when I was asking your opinion on the show, the first thing you said was that you thought he was innocent. I'm not entirely sure that he's. I wouldn't be able to put money on the fact that he's innocent, but I definitely don't think that he should be in jail at the moment. And
right, yeah, and this is actually what I said about Serial. Is, do I think Adnan is guilty? I'm not sure. I think he probably is. Do I think he should be in prison? No, because of the same reason, is that there wasn't a fair trial.
And I think the same can be said for Brent. Like, Brendan's life is now ruined, and it's all because he was completely manipulated by the police. And
yeah,
the way that they treat him was atrocious. Like, the fact that it's even admissible in court is just completely shocking to me. And the smear campaign that the police put on and that the prosecution put on Stephen Avery's defense because they dared to question the honorability of some of the police in that city was absurd, because he was actively suing at the time that he was accused of it. Stephen Avery was actively suing the police department, and it was like, oh, how dare you question these the police department,
these upstanding officers.
well, obviously there's a conflict there, because everybody is aware of him. Everybody knows his history, because he was put in jail for 13 years for 18 years and then acquitted. They have a huge conflict of interest there, but they were like, "Oh, how dare you question the police?" Because they're clearly just trying to, protect citizens, and it was just bullshit. And
yeah. I'm sure the documentary had a bias in the way it was presented, and obviously you kind of had that in the back of your mind.
But documentaries have a message they want to get across. Like, it's like Steve Jobs documentaries as well. Like, all documentaries have a message and a view that they're trying to say, and they'll always present the story in a way that supports what they're trying to get across, and that's evident in this too. But
there's some evidence in there that is just like, when they present it with the fact, it's like, for example, the key is the one I'm thinking of. It's like, oh, they didn't find this key until like the 7th search of his home, but now they found a key with his fingerprint on it, I think, or maybe it didn't, but it was in his bedroom, and it was the key to the missing car. Oh, well, who found the key? Was it one of these people who's investigating on the case? No, it's somebody who's been specifically removed from the case because Stephen Avery had filed a lawsuit against him and the department, and he had sat in a deposition caused by Stephen Avery just a month earlier, and now here he is. Oh, he's found a key on Stephen Avery's property.
After 8 searches, they searched it for it was like their 8th visit or something, and they found nothing, nothing, and then all of a sudden there's a key with DNA on it on the floor, and some of the evidence, like,
that is, to me, is totally inadmissible, just by the fact that who found it? Oh, the guy who has a clear bias and is clearly involved in the case. Okay, inadmissible.
Yeah. And well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really say what can and can't be admitted in a court, but I think that it was shocking watching it, and I think that if that is how the criminal justice system works in America, then they need to address that, because it's bewildering to me. And also, Ken Kratz is a complete scumbag.
I mean, the fact that they're showing this means that it's I wouldn't say it's a one-off, but it's definitely not the norm. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a very good documentary, I guess.
Well, it's not an easy thing to make. They said it took them 10 years to do it. It's not an easy... Not anybody can dedicate a decade of their life to building this story.
So these filmmakers actually jumped onto the case after he was charged with this second murder, after being acquitted of the first one. And so that's when they jumped in. So they jumped in before the court case. It's not like they saw this court case play out and they were like, hang on, this looks like it was a totally, a thing that is abnormal. They just started filming it. And what became apparent is that none of this adds up, and this isn't right. But I would like to think that they could have had a scenario where actually everything does add up and they don't really have a documentary at the end of the day. Because I would like to think that not all cases end up that way.
I don't know. It upset me. It upset me more than I thought it would. But I did say, like, it was about 3 or 4 episodes into it, I said, I think this is incredibly biased. I think that it's very one-sided, but I still don't think that it's incorrect. I don't think it's too big a reach, the conclusion they're trying to push you towards. It is a bit heavy-handed at times, though. It's good, though. Everyone should watch it, even though we just like went through it all.
Yeah, it's a great documentary series, and I haven't heard anyone say, I tried it and I didn't like it. Other than myself, I should say, because I watched the first... No, this is kind of typical of me, though. So I watched... What happened was I started watching it, and it got to the bit about 15 minutes into the first episode where they had to go through Stephen's backstory, and they had to tell you when he was 18 years old, he went to prison because he set fire to the family's cat, and it died. And that, to me, like we had a cat which died when I was about 11. And I bloody
Did
loved.
you set fire to it?
No. I bloody loved that cat, and I was very upset when it died. I can't relate to having a family pet when you're 18 years old and using it as a joke and doing something like that, and then feeling bad for yourself when you go to prison for it and thinking, oh, well, I miss my kid growing up because of the cat incident. I'm like, the cat incident? Come on. You killed the family cat. You burned it. Like, that's a real, like, I was just totally turned off him. And so I just, like, kind of turned it off after that point. And then I went back, like, a week later, and I was like, okay, let's give this a chance, because it might be bigger than that. And it turns out it was. It's bigger than Stephen Avery as a person. It's more about the corruption in the system as a whole than, oh, look at this poor guy who had this bad thing done to him.
So you turned off to the entire documentary because you didn't like how he treated his cat?
Because if they're trying to get me to be sympathetic towards this guy who might have been wrongly imprisoned, this guy who previously murdered a cat, I kind of feel like I don't really have much sympathy for him, to be honest. Like,
that's not why he was in jail for 18 years.
No, I know, but I'm like, was there an injustice against him? Do I really care? Like, he's not an upstanding citizen here that we're dealing with. This is a guy who murdered his cat. Like, I don't really. Do I care about the injustice that comes upon him? Not really. But yeah, I'm glad that I continued watching a week later. But yeah, people, everyone has good things to say about this documentary. So if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you've had it. I'm sure this isn't the first you've heard about it. But yeah, go and check it out. Making a Murderer is available on Netflix.
Wow.
$10 a month, I think. My brother pays for it. I just leech off his account.
You also don't pay for things in dollars.
I'm being relatable. How big's our American audience?
It's about 50%.
There you go. There'll be a translated version depending on which side of the world you download it on, and we'll just dub it over.
You're putting extra editing pressure on me now.
More like extra, like, how do you even coordinate that?
Should I put language on it? I should put English US and English UK.
Yeah, we should, like, like when you type into Overcast Mumbly Hour, we should make it so you get Mumbly Hour UK edition, Mumbly Hour US edition. In the US edition, we just replace all of the prices with dollars.
And our accents with your terrible American impression.
Yeah, we dub the whole thing in us doing American impressions. In fact, I do both voices.
Sure you do.
Next, I have discovered that my brother has a box of chocolates. I'm in his room right now, and he's not going to be back here until late March at Easter. I think I should eat the box of chocolates. What do you think?
I agree.
They look so delicious.
I sometimes message my flatmates saying that I've eaten his food. Or that I think that his food is out of date and should go in the bin when he's away when I eat it. I'll send a photo saying, do you still want this? And he'll say no. It's amazing. I love it. Basically, because he buys nicer food than I eat, because I try not to have junk food in the house.
Do you lie to him and say you've chucked it out, or it's gone out of date, and then eat it yourself anyway?
I normally say it's out of date and say I've chucked it out, and then when he comes home, I'll tell him that I ate it because I wanted it. He normally just gives me food anyway. It's the best.
We're going to talk about gravitational waves.
We're going to talk about science, physics in particular.
Yeah. because so this thing came out this week, the gravitational waves. What do I want to call it?
What do you want to call it?
The gravitational wave detection. Discovery. Let's go with the word discovery. So the gravitational waves discovery came out this week, and this was a thing on the news for me. It was a great thing for science, but for you, it was you wrote your dissertation on it, right? Or on that theory?
Yeah, so would you want to go over what it was that they discovered, and then I'll tell you what I did?
Yeah. So the news was that gravitational waves have been discovered. This is a force that exists in the universe, and it allows us to observe the universe in new ways. And it's based on a prediction made by Einstein, or a theory made by Einstein over 100 years ago.
So they weren't discovered; they were detected.
Sure.
Right, and they're not a force. Like gravity is a force. So yeah, so a gravitational wave isn't a force; it's a ripple in space-time.
Mm-hmm. Should I explain what I think this thing is, and then you can fill in the gaps and tell me that it was terrible? And a gravitational wave. Imagine that the sun is moving around, and as the sun moves around, it creates waves in space, much like if you imagine waves in a pool. And so, if you were trying to swim in a forward direction through a pool, and then you encountered a wave coming from like a passing ship, then you would be knocked sort of off kilter, and it would affect your movements. And this is something that Albert Einstein theorized many years ago, and they've been trying to prove it since, and now they've proved it.
Proven.
They've proven that gravitational waves are a thing and they exist. The way that they proved that they exist is that they built this really long tunnel, and they shined a laser from one end of the tunnel to the other because they wanted to see how long it would take for the laser to get back to them. Now, what they could have done is they could have built this really long tunnel and made measurements all the way along, but they would still have the same amount of measurements at any time because that would be stretched. The thing that isn't affected by gravitational waves, and this is just what this is not like a scientist talking, is light isn't affected by them. And so if you shine a laser from one side to the other into a mirror and then back again, and then you see how long it takes for the light to get back to you, you can see whether that distance has shortened or gotten longer. Now, in order to compare this to another result, you need another tunnel, and so that's what they built. They built two tunnels, and they're in an L shape, 90-degree angles to one another, and so they shine lasers out of each tunnel at the same time, and they see how long it takes to get back. And what happened back in October of last year is that one of the lasers took a slightly, very, very slightly longer amount of time to get back, and that was how they detected a gravitational wave. What do you think? Is that accurate?
All right. Yeah. How it's the LIGO detector is how in America is what you're describing, and yeah, that's essentially what it does.
Great. So you think I did a good job?
I'm gonna go over some of it again.
Okay.
You understand the concept of three-dimensional space?
Yes.
Do you understand the concept of four-dimensional space?
No.
Where when I said it was a ripple in space-time, do you understand what that means?
Not really.
So
that's just a phrase. Like I heard that and I was like, okay, that's a phrase that they're using.
Four-dimensional space, where the fourth dimension is time, and space-time is like a mathematical model that puts these two things together. So like the normal Euclidean dimension switches like the three-dimensional space and time together. So how gravitational waves work is like, so gravity is the weakest force in the universe, and it has like an infinite range. Okay, and every body with mass, everybody has some gravitational force, and you can think of it like a trampoline with like a ball sitting in the middle, so it's like sunken in. And what happens with a gravitational wave is that when there's some event, a star exploding, like a star dying, that is a huge destructive event, and that causes a ripple, and that's what the gravitational wave is, because that gravitational force is then changed, and it's like that basketball in the middle of that trampoline bouncing. Essentially, it causes a ripple out, and then we can detect these things. But because they happen at such large scales and gravity is such a weak force, they're very hard to detect because it's very, very like minute differences.
So one thing that I want to ask is that it's been people have said time and time again that these are really difficult to detect and they're really small, like it's barely anything. And I've also heard tossed around this idea that the gravitational about these two black holes which collided, people have mentioned that. So I assume that the wave that they detected was from these black holes colliding. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what happened.
Right, and that was a really strong, that had a lot of energy to it, and that was a really strong gravitational wave. Like, that was one of the strongest ones there's going to be, I guess, or that there could be, and that's what we picked up on a very, very minuscule scale. So my question is, if that is all we get is a tiny, tiny, tiny little bump on a minuscule scale, then why is it so important to our observation of the universe? And why is it such a big deal that we've discovered it?
It's a big deal because general relativity explains pretty much. It's like a description of how like a geometric theory of how gravity works in the universe.
What's general relativity? Is that Einstein's theory?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, general relativity is like his thing. It's a theory that's a little bit different from sort of classical physics that describe like the motion of bodies and how things work in three-dimensional space, and this is the first time we've been able to prove it.
Right.
So in part of general relativity, it predicts, in order for this all to work, it predicts the existence of gravitational waves, because it puts forward a model like that I explained before with like the basketball and the trampoline sort of thing, and this is how everything sits on like a plane, and how all the bodies in the universe like sit on this plane, and in order for that to work, they need to exist in order for this to be true. And the fact that we've detected it is evidence that general relativity is correct and actually quantifiable, because before you just had the maths and it all kind of made sense and all kind of worked, but we had no way of proving it. So the way that like the equations of motions work is that you say, I think this is how collisions work, or I think this is how speed and acceleration works, and you test it by going, I'm going to put a car here and a road here, and I'm going to test how this works, and you can set up an experiment to prove that those things are correct. But because this works on such a grand scale, it's very, very hard and very expensive in order to prove that, and you're reliant on external forces like black holes colliding, which is a very rare event, and it's a hugely destructive event that happens, and they happen very, very, very far away from us, and it takes time for the effects of that to get to us. Because like if you think of the fastest that anything can move in the universe is the speed of light. If you look at the closest large body to us, which is the sun, it takes 8 minutes for light to reach us from the sun. It would take 8 minutes for the light in the sun to go out before we noticed, but we'd be dead before that. So if you think about how far away these black holes are, does that make sense?
I suppose that kind of half answers my question. And by the way, one of the things that I really like about this past week is that when something happens in science and people don't entirely understand it, like me and like most people, because it's quite complicated, it still makes it to the top of CNN and top of BBC News, and people still talk about it. And people still celebrate the fact that a discovery was made, even if they don't understand it. I really like that about humanity, because it's like people recognize that even if they don't understand it, this thing, even if it's not as entertaining as as watching cats do funny things on YouTube. It's or the latest celebrity scandal. It still makes it to the top of the news because people are still really supportive of the discoveries. I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, it's cool.
But I do still feel it's a bit difficult. This is what I'm having difficulty with is explaining this. I still feel a bit frustrated in that I don't entirely understand, like, maybe what the next step is, or how, like, if someone was like, oh, this means that we can now do this thing, because this is really important to this, then it would kind of make sense, but I think I'm just missing that understanding of what this then leads to, or I don't know.
It's just a proving of a theory. It just means that we can... 'cause at the moment, there are various theories for how the universe works, and you have to make an assumption that one of them is correct in order to do something else.
So does this prove Einstein's theory, or does it just make it? Is it just another checkbox?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that it doesn't. I haven't read enough to say whether or not it proves it, but say that it does. Then it means that the field can then focus on discarding the contradictory methods and theories and going, now that we know this is true, we can now explore X.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, that little explanation there kind of makes it all like seem, that kind of answers my question.
Ask me more things.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, which I think will be interesting, actually. So, first of all, because we're talking about Einstein's theory, if they're so hard to detect because they're so minuscule, what was it that made Einstein propose that they exist? What gave him the hint that there was... Or am I totally, like, just...
He came up with a model for how he thinks the universe should work. In order for this all to work, there needs to be the existence of this thing, which was a gravitational wave. So he predicted that they existed because he felt that his model for how the universe worked was right. So he came up with general relativity, and he was like, in order for this to work, gravitational waves exist. But at the time, there was no technology to detect whether or not they do or do not work.
And at the time, did he realise that they would be very, very, very small and basically insignificant?
Well, not insignificant, but he.
But they don't affect things that much, like, at all.
They affect things, or they do. But it's the reason that this one didn't affect us hugely is because we're so far away from it. If two black holes collided close to us, that would be a different thing altogether. Right.
Okay. So they weaken. So it's the wave weaken. I guess like a sea wave.
What I was trying to say before with gravity being a very weak force is that it's very strong. Like, we feel Earth's force very strongly.
Yeah.
Because we're here. But if you're outside our atmosphere, you don't feel our pull of our gravity. But you also don't feel the sun's pull of its gravity. But the gravitational field still exists, and it's infinite. Like, it carries on. It never goes to zero. So each body's gravitational pull carries on, but it just gets very weak. It's just a very, very weak force. So
when I'm describing it as, it's this very, very, very small, not force. Fucking hell.
It's the small ripple, and it's called a ripple in space.
Yeah, so I'm a disturbance in the force. So I'm describing it as a very, very, very small thing, but that's only because
we're really far away from it.
That's how it is when it gets to us. But that's not how it's always been. Like, two black holes colliding doesn't come out with a very, very, very tiny effect. It actually comes out with a very strong one, which weakens over time and as it travels. And so by the time it gets to us, it's very, very weak, but non-zero.
Yeah. So
okay, that makes more sense.
Cool. It's like you have like do you know, because you mentioned Star Wars, you know how it had Tatooine has two suns?
Yeah.
Remember the iconic shot of Luke Skywalker?
Yeah, I do. Suns, right? I'm just thinking. I'm not sure I'm about to believe that George Lucas had gravitational waves in mind. But go on.
No, he did, right. So that's a binary star system where you've got two suns, and that's where two stars sort of orbit each other,
Mm-hmm.
and that emits a gravitational energy in the form of a gravitational wave as well. So that pushes out gravitational waves. But it's all to do with a perspective of the size of the event. So like when we're talking about the sun blowing up earlier on,
Mm-hmm.
that would cause a gravitational wave, because that would cause a huge ripple in the gravitational field that surrounds the sun, or like that dip in space time. If you go back to the basketball trampoline analogy, like how that sits, if you like disturb that ripple will be larger than if, for example, a meteor hit the sun.
Right.
That's going to be a lot more insignificant. So two black holes colliding was a big enough event that we could detect it.
Okay.
Because black holes are bad news.
So my question, you have answered it, but my question, I kind of expected a different answer. So my question was, if they're so hard to detect, what was it that made Einstein propose that they exist? And the implication in that question is, if they're so hard to detect because they're so terribly small, but actually the truth is they're not always terribly small. It's just that the ones that we can detect are really small, because that's what's happened once they've reached us.
Your question was, why did he come up with it, or why did he predict that they exist? Right. It's not to do with their significance. It's to do with the fact that they have to exist to fit the model. Without it, his model for gravity wouldn't work. And
but my thought was they would be so terribly small that you would never be able to know that anything was different.
These elements at this scale, where you're talking about how fundamentally how the universe works and how bodies interact with each other, everything is significant.
Yeah, I understand that.
Regardless of how big and small an impact it has, everything is significant. So the fact,
but I just meant if they're so hard to detect in the way that I'm thinking that if two things collided, if these two black holes collided, and what came out of that was a tiny, tiny, tiny thing, how could Einstein, over 100 years ago, before we have the technology we have now, what made him come up with that? And you've kind of answered that in that it does have a big impact. All right, next question. So these waves aren't the wave that we detected. This isn't a continuous thing where they just ran this experiment back in October and they got a result to show the existence of these waves straight away. The lab was set up 22 years ago, but they only just detected a wave. Is that because these tiny waves come through so sparsely that there haven't been any for 22 years?
Well, no, they happen all the time, but it's really, really difficult to detect them, in the sense that, like, because they're so infinitesimally small and the signals are so weak, that if you've seen where the LIGO detector is built?
No.
It's built in the middle of the desert. I guess out in Nevada, I can't remember. It's in the middle of the desert in the west of the States, and like if it was next to a road, like a truck driving alongside it can knock off the effects that they would detect. That's how.
Okay, I see. Because my next question was also going to be.
It's like you know CERN, the Large Hadron Collider. It's not on all the time, and it like. There's so many factors to come into it that you need to account for all the noise and the variance in the results. So
this laser was coming back at a different time, at a different like a split second late, caused by like trucks going past.
Like the vibrations. The vibrations in the ground can discount the effect of the signal. So the signal in like that was just an analogy, like a truck going past. But you also have things like thermal noise, so like variations in the temperature. So you know when things heat up and get cold, they contract and expand.
Yeah.
So like things that are frozen are smaller. Things that like.
So if things were in the process of expanding or contracting while they were running this test, because it's on such a small scale,
that can cause ground vibrations as a. That can cause ground vibrations that can knock off the effect as well. Like it's these kind of things they have to overcome. and it can be very difficult because when you're firing light between these reflective surfaces, they can't be disrupted by anything.
Right. Okay. So this is really useful because in one of the videos I watched, they went on to say that they had to detect this tiny signal in amongst a lot of noise, and it was like trying to identify a song that somebody's humming across the room at a really loud party. And this is the bit that lost me because I was like, well, hang on, I don't understand what's this thing about all of these signals, like what are all the other signals. That was the part that lost me. So I'm glad that you've answered that.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise you need to account for. And
because I didn't understand what they meant by noise, like that was the bit where they kind of like veered to the left, and I wasn't with them.
Their analogy was probably pretty poor because they were talking about actual noise in a room. So it's probably quite hard to take that out and put it in another context. But yeah, but that's kind of what it means.
Your explanation was better. I will send them your details.
Send them my paper. I'll put my paper up on the website so that people can read it. I should probably read it too so I can try and understand because I've done a piss poor job of trying to explain this.
You're doing okay so far. It's a difficult thing to explain. I think that's all I've got.
Right, so we should round up. So if you have thoughts on anything that we've talked about, if you've seen Deadpool and you want to tell us about it, or if you watched Making a Murderer and it made you as angry as it made me, or you listen,
or if Andrew has his facts wrong about gravitational
waves,
waves.
Most definitely do. I would love people to correct me on my facts about gravitational waves. You should get in touch with us. Let us know. You can email us at mumblyhour@gmail.com. We have a Twitter account which is @mumblyhour. If you want us to talk about different stuff, you can go to listen.co/contact, and all of our links and ways to get in touch with us are all there. And if you enjoyed the show, you should rate and review in iTunes, recommend it Overcast, tell your friends, tell your lovers, tell your dogs, and your cats, because you're a cat person.
Unless you burn them.
Yeah, don't burn your cats. I missed the part where he killed his cat. I must have not been paying attention to that.
I didn't miss it. I thought he was a villain.
I don't really care for cats. I mean, I don't wish any harm upon them, but